Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, a ColumbiaDC board member and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for joining us this evening. Very fortunate to have, an honor to have Volker R. Berghahn, Seth, a Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, to talk to us about my Marshall Plan, its implementation, its origins, and its legacy. And as most of you know, this is coinciding with the 75th anniversary of the Marshall Plan being announced in 1947 at a Harvard graduation ceremony. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker. I would encourage everyone to check our website for Professor Berghahn's full bio. Professor Berghahn is Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, specializing in modern German history and European American relations. He received his master's from UNC Chapel Hill and his PhD from University of London. He taught in England and Germany before coming to Brown in '88 and to Columbia eventually 10 years later. Among his publications are America and the Intellectual Cold War in Europe, Quest for Economic Empire, the Americanization of West German industry from 1945 to 1973, and modern Germany, Europe in the era of the two world wars, and most recently, American big business in Britain and Germany. Professor, it's all yours.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here and also to see you. But let me begin by thanking Kambiz for, first of all, inviting me and then introducing me. And thirdly, he actually mastered this wonderful technology that we all depend on so that we can not only hear each other this evening and hopefully have a lively discussion at the end of it, but also see each other. Now, I think some of you may have participated earlier on in a webinar which I organized with Dr. Colin Becker about neoliberalism and then a comparison with the Northern European welfare state. That was rather more controversial, I suppose. This time it's only me, not very controversial, I hope, for about 40 minutes or so. And then I hope you will ask some very taxing questions in the question and answer period on the Marshall Plan, but also, as you will have seen only a few weeks ago, Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, actually proposed that we should consider the introduction of a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine once peace has broken out again in Eastern Europe. I would like to talk a little bit about the immediate origins of the Marshall Plan, but then in my second part would like to look at the deeper historical roots going back as far as the First World War. And then finally, in my third part, I would like to look at the implementation of the Marshall Plan in 1948 following, and in this context also look at the role of big business, which should not be ignored actually when we look at this. Now, I should warn you, this is partly a lecture which is structural, but it's also very biographical, because I think I would like to focus on some of the key people who were involved in the reconstruction of Europe after the devastating Second World War. So, as to my first point, the US had two major problems when the war ended in 1945. There was, first of all, the human and material devastation that the Nazis has caused in the whole of Europe. And that devastation, as you well know, was really horrific. Funds were clearly needed, not only for human reconstruction, but also for economic reconstruction, especially since the Nazis had really violated all human and material norms during the Second World War. And the other point that is important here at the end of the war is that the United States had actually emerged stronger economically from the Second World War than the United States had been in 1939 or 1941. And the second question that was on the table at the time is what to do about Germany. The crimes that the Nazis were committing in the Second World War were known in Washington from 1943 at the latest. And in 1944-45, you then had, as you know, the liberation of the concentration camps and the extermination camps, and the images that appeared in the press and in the newsreels were, of course, these horrific images of piles of bodies. You may remember the very moving film of Night and Fog that came out in those years. Well, but there was also the other question, namely that this problem of what to do with the Germans had essentially already been settled by 1945. And here I would like to introduce now, first of all, Henry Morgenthau, the US Secretary of the Treasury under Roosevelt. And he, as you will know, had developed a plan to deal with Germany, the so-called Morgenthau Plan, which took a very punitive approach to the Germans. And that was perfectly understandable in light of all the things he already knew about what had happened in occupied Europe. But then, of course, he presented this Morgenthau Plan at the Quebec Conference in September 1944, where indeed you had the first attempt by Churchill and by Roosevelt to come to some kind of agreement before the conferences with Stalin were continued after, in 1945, especially the Potsdam Conference. And here you can see them, Churchill and Roosevelt posing at Quebec, at the Quebec Conference. Now, what I think is important about the Morgenthau Plan is that it was not a plan to re-agrarianize the Germans and German society. I think that was Goebbels's propaganda, of course, that was put out in 1944-45 to terrify the Germans and keep them going till the bitter end. But you had, of course, the plan to destroy the war-making capacity of German industry and of German heavy industry in the Ruhr area in particular. So I think a good deal of research has been done on the Morgenthau Plan and what it contained and what was it aiming at. But I think it's now generally accepted that we have to focus on the industrial side rather than turning German society into an agricultural society again. But the Morgenthau was still around. It was discussed at the Quebec Conference. And although Churchill initially approved this plan, it was turned down. And the reason for this was that the main opposition to implementing this plan came from the State Department and the War Department. And then, of course, within a few months, the war ended. You had the occupation of Germany. Here is a photo of divided Germany occupied in several zones. And also in the east, of course, the eastern territories were already allocated to Poland in 1945. So, as you can see, there were major decisions being made, but some of the elements of the Morgenthau did survive in 1945 and are actually enshrined in a directive that was issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS 1067, which on the one hand provided for the dismantling of German industry and especially the Ruhr industry. Then secondly, it provided also for the denazification of German society, and a re-education program was also introduced because the hope was that it would be possible to democratize German society so that it would never lapse into the kind of dictatorial, totalitarian dictatorship that had just ended. Well, at the local level there, you did have something like a Morgenthau plan, because the denazification procedures went ahead. All Germans had to fill in a questionnaire in which they had to reveal all their political affiliations, and they were then supposed to appear before a tribunal, first of American soldiers and officers, but later also Germans were added to these tribunals, where they were classified depending on the kind of record that they had under National Socialism. So it was really quite a vigorous beginning, if you like, of what you wanted to do with Germany. But at the same time, you had humanitarian measures taken by the Americans and by the Allies in particular. And I would like to show you now some of these photos, which you will have seen, because Germany was absolutely devastated. You can see here the Brandenburg Gate also, and the fighting that took place until the last minute in May 1945. And there you see some other ruins, Hamburg, the miracle of the Cologne Cathedral not being damaged, whereas everything around it was flattened by aerial bombing. So I think in addition to these disasters, you had millions not only of bombed out people, but also refugees who had fled in advance of the Red Army to the western zones of occupation. And you also had demobbed returning soldiers milling around Germany. And under international law, this is an important point also to remember. Now, the occupiers are responsible not just for law and order, but also for the feeding of populations. You may remember Colin Powell's famous dictum at the time of the beginning of the Iraq War, when he told George W. Bush, well, if you occupy Iraq now, you own it. And that was, of course, the short-term task now to provide food and sustenance for the German population and for the European population more generally. But there is also a long-term consideration from the very beginning, namely the need to reconstruct and to reintegrate Germany into a larger European community. That was an aim which was formulated quite clearly also early on. And in fact, General Clay, who was the US military governor in occupied Germany at the time, toured Germany and saw these images of German cities and said, well, I think we've already achieved the destruction of Germany. But interestingly enough, he was a Southerner and had probably remembered from school the American Civil War and Sherman's march through the South. And therefore, this also, I think, motivated him to say, well, we have to begin to think of reconstruction and the reintegration of the societies of Europe, and including Germany. Now, let me shift at this point more quite radically already into 1946, because by September 1946, it comes out that American thinking and strategy had already shifted away from the original more punitive approach. James Burns, Secretary of State, made a famous speech in September 1946 at Stuttgart in southwest Germany, in which he held out hopes to the Germans that they would also eventually be part of a European reconstruction effort. And then, of course, a few months later, there was George F. Marshall, Burns' successor as Secretary of State, who gave his famous speech at Harvard in June 1947. The interesting thing, if you read that speech, is really quite wide-ranging because it includes a sentence indicating that the Marshall Plan could be extended to all of Europe, all European societies. In other words, there was at that point still a sense that the East Bloc countries might be included in this reconstruction program. But Stalin, when he heard about this, declined this and of course established his own reconstruction and Soviet bloc. But in some ways, I would like to say that this was a blessing in disguise, perhaps, because I think if Eastern Europe had been included in the reconstruction effort, American reconstruction efforts in Europe, I think it would have been much more expensive, partly because you were dealing with agricultural societies also in Eastern Europe, and also because I think opposition in Congress would have been much stronger to mobilize all the funding that was necessary. So Stalin's refusal, of course, however, reflected rising tensions already between East and West. There were some hopes initially in 1945 that the wartime alliance would actually continue into the peace period, but the alliance was already fraying by 1946. All too many incompatibilities emerged, power political, economic, also ideological. And I think the memories of 1917 also came back into German society. You may actually have seen or remember seeing many years ago the American movie Reds with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, where there is a wonderful scene. I think his family came from Seattle, and there was this young man who had just come back from Russia and was very enthusiastic about Lenin. And there was his family around the table having dinner, and all of them looked rather glum because they were really quite terrified by what was happening in Russia at the time. So the alliance between the Soviet Union and the West was really lasted from 1941 to 1945, and was really to defeat the Axis powers. And though now I would like to move into the broader historical context and go back in my second point to the First World War. And my discussion here is, I think, based on some new evidence that is, it seems to me, very relevant to the Marshall Plan, because I'm interested in strategic elites and how decision makers integrate historical knowledge into their decisions, either because these decision makers experienced these events themselves in the past, or they had pondered them retrospectively, looking back on the implications of these earlier events. And my interest is therefore very much in the capacities of elites to learn from history also, and the insights that were then applied to later events. So the First World War, if I may start with it, again, like the Second World War, had a devastating impact on Europe. You have seen perhaps the moon landscapes of northern France and Belgium. Here they are, and how they affected, obviously, also the perceptions of people after the First World War. I would like to mention merely the German delegation when it moved through northern France by train to Paris, to the Paris Peace Conference, to sign the Versailles Treaty. And they actually drew the curtains of their compartment because they just couldn't see what was appearing outside their windows as they went by train through these areas. However, there were a few Americans who also went to see what had happened in northern France and Belgium. And one of them I have become very interested in is Frank van der Lip. He is one of these people who I think have been underestimated in their importance in the background to the events after the First World War. He was the CEO of the National City Bank in New York, a Wall Street bank, owned by the Rockefeller family. And he had retired in 1918, 1919, having been involved in the war effort as well as a banker, and decided to travel with an assistant to Western Europe and also to Eastern Europe to inspect the devastation that had happened. He knows, of course, at the same time very well how powerful the United States had become economically, because just as in 1945, the United States had gained economically in strength if compared with the pre-1914 period. So he comes back to Europe, to the United States, Frank van der Lip, and the idea occurred to him already while he was in Europe to float a huge reconstruction loan with the help of Swiss and Swedish banks, who were also fairly prosperous after the First World War. And of course, when he puts this proposal both in writing and in articles to his colleagues in 1919, they immediately say, yes, well, maybe we can do this, but we have to secure this loan. And therefore you have to go, or we have to go to Washington to get Congress to underwrite this plan, this private loan, reconstruction loan, with taxpayers' money. And you can imagine what happened. There was no chance in Washington for this kind of a plan to be underwritten by Congress. Isolationism in this country was very stark still and strong. And as a result of this, the whole plan failed. But I think it would be very interesting to do research on this aspect of the peace settlement, because we have focused so much on Wilson and what happened in Paris, and then afterwards Wilson traveling through the United States trying to persuade the population that the peace plan should be accepted, which it then wasn't, as you know. So he is an interesting figure in this, and we should do much more research on this. Now, with this having failed, this did not mean that the United States were faring badly in the mid-1920s. As you know, the banks were flush, the economy was growing again, there was a consumer boom. Henry Ford was one of the beneficiaries of this consumer boom, but you also had an overheating of the stock market. The stocks were just going through the roof, and as a result of this, as you know, you had in 1929 then the collapse of the world economy. First, the banks in this country, the loans that had been given to Europe on a private basis were called back. German banks and European banks closed their doors, and you have mass unemployment. And as a result of this, also a radicalization of politics in Germany. As you know, you have the rise of Hitler in those years. And in 1933, Hitler seizes power. He promises, of course, jobs and immediately places orders with German industry, public orders. And here it might be argued he is influenced by Keynesianism, because Keynes had become noted at the time as the advocate of a solution of the crisis. Don't adopt an austerity program, don't cut public expenditures, but rather pump public monies into the economy. But the problem with the Germans and Hitler was that he resorted to what has been called a military Keynesianism. The aim was, of course, to rearm Germany, to invest public money in rearmament with the aim, as he had already outlined in his Mein Kampf in the 1920s, to conquer living space in the East for the Germans. And I have to cut this short now, but I think you will know that this is the background to Hitler unleashing this expansionist, aggressive war in Eastern Europe, first against Poland and later against the Soviet Union in 1939. So at that point, the war was already a world war, because there was not only Germany as a member of the Axis, but also Japan and Italy in the 1930s that had been formed. And therefore, when Pearl Harbor happened and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, leading the United States in the war, and Hitler, which is often forgotten, actually declaring war on the United States, you have suddenly the sort of expansion of the war into a genuine world war. But given American economic power in particular, and once American industry is mobilized for this war effort, it is quite early on, I think, pretty certain that the Axis powers will lose this war. But this is where now the memory comes in already when the planning begins, post-hostilities planning in Washington in 1942-43. Because after the defeat of the Axis powers, I think there was a strong feeling in Washington already that you had to take a different approach to the reconstruction of Europe after the devastation that the Germans had wrought in the rest of Europe. And this time it was quite clear that the public and the state had to take a lead, and you had to have public investments. And that is the Marshall Plan. It is a plan to use public investments and taxpayers' money in order to aid the Europeans in their effort to reconstruct. It was, of course, reinforced by the Cold War and by the growing conflict between East and West from 1947 onwards, when George Marshall made his speech, but it was not the only cause or single cause. What I think is behind it is this strategic consideration. And there was, of course, as in 1919, opposition in the United States against the Marshall Plan. But it's very interesting now how you have this learning capacity coming into play. I would like to mention John Foster Dulles, who was a young man and was in Paris at the peace conference and saw, of course, what had happened to it. So he was among those who said we have to do things differently, even before he became Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And there is his brother also, the director of the CIA, who was going on in Europe and had actually written a book in which he wrote about the Marshall Plan and the need to get this through Congress. But fortunately, in this case, there were not just the Democrats and Harry Truman as president who wanted the Marshall Plan, but also some Republicans. And I would like to mention here again Arthur Vandenberg, who was also, I think, a major figure. Here he is on your right. There is Clay, actually, and I will talk about Paul Hoffman in a moment. However, I think it is important now to mention that while all these discussions were going on to pass the Marshall Plan in Washington, you had rising tensions also between East and West. And 1948 is therefore a crucial turning point also because of the start of the Berlin blockade by Stalin. There is Clay's famous dictum of 1948 when he reported to Washington from Germany, if we lose Berlin, he said, and wrote, we will lose Germany, and if we lose Germany, we will lose the whole of Europe. And that was, of course, the incentive now to mobilize the economic power of the United States to reconstruct or help reconstruct the European economy via the Marshall Plan. But it must also be related to another aspect that also becomes important, namely the security aspect. And this is also the period when the first discussions begin that lead in 1949 then to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where American military power is then added to the economic power, and security, the security dimension is added. So with Washington in the lead, business interests are now becoming interested in what is going on with the Marshall Plan. Bankers and manufacturers traveled to Europe in 1948-49 and tried to inspect what is going on. And here I would now like to make the link between the Marshall Plan planning and passage of the Marshall Plan in Washington in 1948 with Paul Hoffman, whom you see here in the middle, the administrator of the Marshall Plan. I think he's a very interesting guy also, like Van der Lepp, because he was a former president of Studebaker, had in World War II been involved in the founding of the Committee on Economic Development in 1942-43, which was a forum in which big business began to discuss the post-war settlement. And I would merely like to mention two other people who were involved in the CED, namely Philip Reed of General Electrics, very important, and Beardsley Rummel of the Macy's Corporation. So these were advocates not only of the Marshall Plan, but also advocates of the open door that they wanted to create a multilateral world trading system coming out of this peace settlement in the West and the Marshall Plan. There would be no more autarky, as has been attempted by the Nazis and the Axis powers. There would be no more colonialism and imperialism. There would be no more cartels, i.e. this peculiar European but mainly German tradition of organizing industry in terms of cushy arrangements between independent firms who would collaborate and decide on production quotas and sales quotas, etc. So I hope you can see that these people were really making a major contribution now. And of course, as Americans, they were in favor of competition. Of course, being corporate leaders, they were in favor of oligopolistic competition, not of small scale, totally fragmented capitalist competition. So a good example, if I may mention this, is perhaps now Otto Friedrich, who was the CEO of the Phoenix Tire Company in Hamburg in the late 40s. And the interesting link here is again biographical. His brother, some of you will know him, was Karl Joachim Friedrich, a famous political scientist at Harvard University, very influential when it came to the shaping of the basic law, the constitution of the Federal Republic, but also a mediator between the business and political communities in the United States and in Germany. Now, Otto, his brother, had been a young man and had been to the United States in the 1920s, where he had worked for Goodyear. And therefore, when he began to travel again and try to establish business contacts now with American industry. He went to Ohio, initially contacting Goodyear, but eventually he made a deal with Firestone, actually. And that is now the other parallel link that you have to see underlying the Marshall Plan also, that in this way, not only American private investments, corporate investments came to Europe, but also modern technology. For example, what Goodyear and Firestone had to offer the Europeans and the Germans were tubeless tires, which they did not have. So if you look at the map now of Germany during the reconstruction years of the late 40s and early 50s, you can see how the Marshall Plan was not only affecting industry, but also agriculture, urban renewal. Cities were being built up again. The port cities were becoming involved in international trade again. And it is in this context that Hoffmann, who's still the administrator of the Marshall Plan, who supervises the distribution of funds through the Marshall Plan to various European countries, he encourages now, in addition to this, the creation of a larger European market. And the key person with whom he collaborates in this enterprise is Jean Monnet, one of the other individuals who are, I think, very important. Jean Monnet came from a middle-sized family enterprise. Here you can see him. The image before actually showed the introduction, the flow of funds to different European countries, and how Britain and France in particular, but also Germany, it is included in the Marshall Plan. And that was, of course, the calculation that you would use German industry also, whose capacity was still considerable for the reconstruction of Europe. At any rate, Monnet, when the Nazis occupied France, went to London with de Gaulle, and of course was then discovered actually by Churchill when he was putting together a delegation to be sent to Washington to negotiate with the Americans the transfer of aid, military aid, but also food aid across the Atlantic during the Second World War. And he organizes these deliveries with other people who are sent over, the Brits who are also involved in this. But he hears, being in Washington, of course, about the American discussions about post-war strategies and what to do when the war is over. And as a result of this, he hears about the plans of creating an American open-door multilateral world economy again after the war. And as a result of this, he says, the first thing we must do, having come back to France in 1945-46, we must modernize our own industry to bring them up to scratch so that they can compete actually with in the newly open door multilateral American-dominated economy. But in the meantime, what he had also become convinced of was Franco-German reconciliation. At first, this reconciliation, interestingly enough, took place actually at the business level, because it was Ruhr industrialists and northern French industrialists who began to talk in 1949-50 about cooperation and creating a larger economic community in Western Europe. But the problem was, of course, that Monnet was rather suspicious of these private initiatives, and therefore he looks at the alternative and creates the alternative of a larger customs union, which would, however, be supervised and organized and controlled by a high authority, which was the umbrella overarching this motion. And it is, of course, known as the Schuman Plan of 1951, that was eventually ratified, which should really be called, however, the Monet Plan. So Hoffmann encourages these efforts by Monet to create the European coal and steel community as the first embryo, if you like, of a larger integration that he also already had in mind. And in 1951, therefore, you have the creation of the European coal and steel community of the six, the Benelux states and Italy, plus France and Germany are put together. And here you get the embryo, of course, of the later efforts of creating the European Economic Community and ultimately the European Union after 1989. So let me come to a conclusion. The immediate origins, I think, are fairly straightforward, Burns and Marshall's initiatives. But the important point is that this was a publicly funded initiative and reconstruction aid, learning from the mistakes of 1919. Private industry would follow in the wake of these public efforts that put American taxpayers ultimately on the hook. And of course, while the tensions, the growing tensions with the Soviet Union helped in this, the deeper roots of this must be found in 1919 and then in early Second World War, 42, 43, when in Washington, people began to think and strategize about how they would organize the economy, world economy, after the defeat of Hitler and the fascists in Italy and the Japanese. So here you get the deeper roots, and I would like to stop here and simply thank you for listening. And now you will probably want to challenge me quite extensively about all sorts of problems that I've raised but not been able to answer. So thank you very much.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We are getting a bunch of questions already coming in. My name is Miyako Yerrick. I'm the admin for the ColumbiaDC Club. So again, just everybody listening, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box, and I will be going through them now with the professor. Okay, so we have about 6 questions. I'm just going to jump right in if that's all right with you, and we'll see how many we can get through in the next about 45 minutes or so. Okay, so we have a question from one of our viewers asking if you can discuss the subversive role of leftist and populist movements in post-war Europe in fighting against the Marshall Plan. And they ask, why did they eventually fail considering the rife atmosphere for anti-imperialism?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, as I indicated, you did have opposition, but I think it's important to realize that this was before the internet and social media. So it was obviously, if you wanted to organize a populist movement that we now are grappling with, of course, that was more difficult. And therefore, deputies, congressional deputies were not under the same kind of pressure, that they were terrified that the voters would turn against them the moment they said a wrong thing about their own program. So I think it is important, therefore, that I think this was still a time when parliaments were important. Politicians were also more responsible and were not lying all the time or putting misinformation out. And I think they were also sufficiently apprised of what was going on in the world. it was not as provincial, if you like, as it is perhaps in many ways today. And as a result of this, I think Congress was really key in these efforts to get a public commitment, taxpayers' commitment to the reconstruction aid in Europe. And that is where, of course, these senators were so important again. As I mentioned, there were some Republican senators, even in those days, who were opposed to the Marshall Plan. But it was then key people like Arthur Vandenberg who actually sort of persuaded his colleagues successfully, not like today, to go along and subscribe to the resolution to introduce the Marshall Plan. And of course, the Democrats, one would have to look at the vote in the Marshall Plan. I don't have this in front of me now. I think were, of course, also partly skeptical and opposed, perhaps even, but they were the presidential party, and Truman wanted the Marshall Plan. His Secretary of State had made a speech where he had actually promised that this kind of program would be implemented and submitted to Congress, and that's what happened. I hope that is a fairly plausible answer on a different phase of European history from what it is today, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was reminded while you were speaking, I was a history major at Columbia, and I wrote my senior thesis on Marshall Plan propaganda films. So there were films that the US government put together about various different European countries talking about the devastation after the war and how they needed help. And so they were shown to an American audience. But what I noticed in these films is that rather than speaking just about the devastation from the war or how they needed to rebuild and they needed American support, it was more that they shifted the focus to communism, and that was how they created this like external enemy in order to then refocus away from just kind of the need for aid, but saying we need to help them fight against the communists. And that was part of how they got American public support behind them.
Yes. Well, again, this is a very good question that relates to what I was just talking about, because I think Marshall Plan propaganda is also very interesting. Of course, we still have all the posters that were put out. Unfortunately, we haven't got any among the photos that were, of course, trying to persuade. But I think, as I indicated, from 1948, Berlin blockade onwards, there was a growing sense that this was also an operation that was directed against the Soviet Union, because there was the growing fear, military fear also, as you know, that is the background to NATO, that the Soviets might actually come into Germany across the zonal border and invade the whole of Europe.
There's a comment from Henry. He says, we often think of the Marshall Plan as the highest nobility, but Paul Hoffman said it was the best bargain the American people ever bought, suggesting that it was more a purchase of American self-interest, security, and world domination. And so Henry asks, which one do you think is more accurate?
Well, I think it is, of course, always the calculation behind it. It's not pure altruism that this Marshall Plan, as I indicated, also was promulgated. But there was also American business interests, as I said, behind it, because they saw investment opportunities, superior technology, tubeless tires, if you like, to be brought to Europe. And of course, they also have this vision of establishing a sort of open door, multilateral world trading system in which, of course, they would be the hegemonic power. This was part of this Pax Americana, the American peace that people talked about. So it's partly, of course, self-interest and business interests also, but I think there was also a conviction underlying this, that this was an important thing to do, given the devastation and the misery that the Second World War had left in Europe. So that would be my answer. I don't know whether it is convincing.
Okay, we have a couple of questions on sort of the Soviet Union's integration or working with the satellite. So Michael says, how hampered was the German recovery by the Soviet kidnapping of many technically oriented Germans who then remained captive in the USSR until the mid-50s? And then we had another question asking if it came as a surprise that the Soviet Union and its satellites at its direction rejected Marshall Plan aid. So could their having accepted Marshall Plan aid resulted in more of an integration with the American economy and then effectively ended communism in Eastern Europe?
Well, let me start with the second question about the satellites, what I called Eastern Europe, that Marshall actually also mentioned in his speech. I think it is important to realize that the situation was more open at first in 1945-46. The Cold War didn't start, immediately as an almost hot war. On the contrary, you had throughout Europe the search for a third way, actually, and that also applied to Czechoslovakia, Poland. The intellectuals there, politicians, were looking for a path between Soviet Stalinism, which they all feared, and American capitalism. And I think it is in this twilight zone that you had these attempts actually also to find solutions that involved Eastern Europe and not just Western Europe. As far as the technical side is concerned, well, that's a very interesting problem, because I think there is quite an extensive literature now on how far the Western allies, especially the Americans, benefited from German technology in certain sectors, but also how far the Russians, the Soviets, benefited from technologists who they invited to live in the Soviet Union. And the most famous example in this country is, of course, Wernher von Braun, the developer of the V1 and V2 rocket weapons, who was sent to Huntsville in Alabama to help developing the intercontinental missiles that, of course, were part of the increasing arms race that the two sides were involved in, which was also a technological race. The more so when, after the development of the atomic bomb, which was dropped first in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, when you had also the development of the hydrogen bomb, and then also the delivery capacities on both sides to inflict, of course, horrendous damage on the two sides. So I think there is some quite interesting literature looking at German technology and how it was exported. It was not just the importing of American technology, civilian technology, but it was not to a minor extent also the involvement of German technologists, technicians who went to the United States or to the Soviet Union.
Okay, well, I would be remiss if I did not ask this question, because about 5 people have already asked it tonight. And it's, of course, how do we take lessons learned here and apply it to Ukraine?
Well, I'm glad it's been raised, because I mentioned Janet Yellen, of course, and I think now we are, of course, in the field not of history, but of current politics and decision making. And one thing I should sort of add at the beginning is I always regret that we will only learn in 30 years' time, or whenever the archives are being opened, what's really going on behind the scenes. And that's also the significance of, I would have thought, Vanderlip and, a lot of the planning that took place in the Second World War. It took a long time for historical research to work this out and to reveal what went on behind the facade. But I think there is a debate already going on about this. I don't know what motivated Janet Yellen, but there is an American scholar, Ben Steil, who's written on the Marshall Plan also, and written, interestingly enough, also on the Bretton Woods Agreement and the other agreements that were signed after 1945 to organize not just production and industry, but also to organize the currency world and finance and banking, etc. So he has actually warned, as far as I know, against this idea of trying to introduce a Marshall Plan. However, I would like to be an optimist, hoping that it will be possible to end this war that Putin has started with some kind of an agreement. I think there will be immediately a major reconstruction effort in the Ukraine. You've seen the photos, they look as bad as Berlin or Hamburg looked in 1945. But I think there will be a major effort, both public, but also, and a joint effort with the Western Europeans, the EU and the Americans to reconstruct. And what may actually happen, speculating about what Europe will look like in 10 years' time, you will have a more modern Ukraine, not just in terms of its agriculture. We now know how important it is actually for world food production, but also in industrial production. And certainly housing, because these buildings, apartment blocks that you have seen being destroyed now, I think they will be rebuilt, partly because the Ukrainian refugees are not permanent refugees. They have been welcomed in Poland and in other European countries, and they have been accommodated, but they have not been put into tent cities permanently, as you have with many refugees from Africa and the Middle East, etc., in Turkey. And as a result of this, there will be many Ukrainians who I believe will want to go back, but they will go back, of course, with a promise that they will ultimately live in houses that will be reconstructed and will be more modern, actually, than what they lived in before Putin invaded the country.
Bob says that the German scientist that you mentioned before was another example of kind of a win-win, where the US got some of those scientists, but we were also helping recover. He says that he's not sure if anything like that can come from Ukraine, but kind of given what you just said, I do think with the recovery that is going to happen in Ukraine, there might be some advances in biotechnology that could help increase the amount of production that Ukraine has. So the win-wins are probably going to be very different today than they were back 75 years ago.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you, but the trouble is I'm a historian, and historians are always cowards. When you ask them about the past, they have all sorts of answers, and I gave you some of them this evening. But when you talk about the future, they usually say, well, if you are looking for blueprints, please go to our engineering department, because that is where you will learn more about what is going to happen in the future. And I don't know whether you've all felt this frustration also, that it's so difficult to know what the outcome of all this is going to be. even from one day to the next. And we have already had so many surprises. The fact that Putin was basically defeated outside Kiev in a few months ago and is now stuck and trying desperately to gain some sort of territory that he can claim that it was worthwhile for Russia to resort to this adventure, this criminal invasion. So therefore, I think we can all speculate, and I wish we could now have an open forum in a big assembly hall and pontificate about what's going to happen in the future, but it's always very difficult.
Okay, I'm going to go back in time to the Marshall Plan now instead of in today's world. I will come back to some more modern questions since we are getting more coming in. But we had a question a while back. Somebody asks, how did the US manage to control the trade deficit and monetary mess of various squabbling European countries, especially West and East Germany and their marks?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think we have become more conscious now that we shouldn't really be too worried about trade deficits and debts, etc., because I think that was part of the settlement to look at the German economy here under Erhard in the early 1950s when he became economics minister. American pressure rein investments and not spend liberally on the reconstruction of Europe with the help of Marshall Plan money, but the Germans actually, interestingly enough, also got some additional funding that was left over from this early phase when American aid, food aid, etc., came into Germany. And as not all that money that had been allocated by Congress again to Germany was spent, it was now used for the reconstruction of German industry. And then there were decisions that German industry and elites there made themselves. They said, what is most important at this early stage now is to reconstruct heavy industry, coal and steel, because we need steel for the reconstruction of German and European industry. And as a result of this, it is very interesting how the secondary industries, the manufacturing industries, stepped back, and the Germans introduced a law which was called the investment aid law, by which they said, we will not go to the bank and ask for money for funding our own production and reconstruction. We will step back and allow the Ruhr industries, with the help, of course, with the European coal and steel community and Monet, etc., and the American investment there, to reconstruct those industries first, because they are fundamental, and everything else will then have to be built on top of this effort.
So we have a few questions kind of the recovery and how it benefited the US. As Europeans exported, we were buying things, but how open was the American market kind of to European exports? And then if you could compare the European recovery to the recovery of Japan and some of the more Eastern countries after World War II that didn't have the Marshall Plan.
Well, very good question. I think the benefit is, of course, considerable to American industry, as I indicated. But what is often forgotten is that while you had all this discussion of the open door and a world trading system without protections and customs barriers, and please, you Europeans, lower your customs barriers when you create your coal and steel community, American industry remained quite protectionist also in certain areas, of course. And you have this, I think, to this day, especially when it comes to fruit production and Florida and California and so on. There are still many barriers, and the Europeans were actually well angry about this and said, you preach us to be anti-protectionist and lower our customs barriers, but you have pretty high customs barriers in certain areas yourselves. But then, of course, as European industry recovered, you had a growing confidence that you could actually compete on a large scale. And I would like to mention here the chemical industry. The chemical industry under the Nazis, IG Farben in particular, was practically a monopoly. It was broken up by the Americans in 1947-48, and they formed 6 chemical companies, Hoechst, Bayer, BASF, and Casella. Casella disappeared subsequently, and there were only 3 big chemical companies. And if you look at them today in this open world market, but also in the American market, Bayer, for example, or BASF, has penetrated and confidently overcome whatever obstacles there were put up by Congress initially. And therefore, I think we've now realized also in the wake of the Putin aggression, how interdependent the world had become in terms of trade and exchange. And therefore, I think this is something that happened, of course, already in the 1980s and 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union also, and this tremendous optimism that you had in Europe, but also in the United States, that now you remember Fukuyama saying, well, the liberal age will come and it's the end of protectionism, and the new era is going to start. So this is what you have to consider as a long-term impact, of course. Even if in 1950 or in 1960, the customs barriers also in this country were still quite high in certain areas. But nevertheless, there was the cant, the ideology of open doors, and therefore, eventually, Congress did open the door, and big European companies like ICI also, and the car companies came into the American market. And that is also the context of the Japanese miracle, if you like, because they, even though they didn't have a Marshall Plan, nevertheless also benefited from this explosion of prosperity that you had in this country and the export opportunities which both South Korea and also Japan gained, partly with very competitive steel making. As you know, Korean and Japanese steel became a serious competitor also to US steel by the 1960s, 70s, and also the same is true of European steel.
Okay, a couple questions on other European countries. So one on the UK and one on France. The French one is somebody asked what you think about the unhelpful role of the French. Just like Russia, they were also removing German heavy machinery and manufacturing equipment to France as reparations. And then the question on the UK is from Megan. How might the UK's post-war struggles been different had there been continuity of Lend-Lease in 1945 and into 46-47? And she says, from her reading, there seemed little understanding of the risk of weakening this key ally while the USSR was rising.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me start with France again, because I think that's a very interesting question, how France was partly pushed along because they obviously also owned the French zone and were responsible for the feeding of the Southwest Germans, this chunk of territory that they gained at Potsdam after they had become the fourth Allied power after the Second World War and were let into the great powers as mentioned. But the French, of course, were very suspicious, understandably, of the Germans. They had suffered enormously twice in 1914 and in 1939 from the German invasion, the destruction of its industries and cities. And obviously, they were therefore looking to get a lever that they could use effectively with their two other allies in the settlement of European or German, the German economy and German reconstruction. And I think it is perfectly understandable that they tried to get a hand on the Ruhr industries. And there were therefore, as I mentioned, these private efforts also to integrate the Ruhr industries with the Lorrainian northern French industries in 1949, 48, 49. But I think it was then Jean Monnet, but also Paul Hoffman and, you know, other Americans who persuaded the French that it was in their interest actually to integrate and get a sort of handle on the German Ruhr industries and economy via an international European agreement, the Community Square and Steel Community, that they finally ratified and signed also in 1951. Now, you had a question about the UK now. Could you repeat that, please?
On how it would be different if Lend-Lease had continued into 47, and if it would have not weakened the UK, especially as the USSR was rising.
Well, I think here you raise a very interesting question, which I've been interested in. One of the strange phenomena of reconstruction is that although the Germans were the enemies of the United States in the Second World War and also in the First World War, they turned to German industry reconstruction after 1945. And I think sidelined British industry. The Brits were actually bitterly disappointed by the treatment that they received by the Americans in 1945. First of all, the scrapping of Lend-Lease and the loans that the Brits hoped to gain for their reconstruction from the Americans. And instead, the Americans became more interested in the Ruhr industries, reconstruction and steel and coal over there. And that now led, of course, to this reaction. Churchill is perhaps the best example of this, of trying to look back to their empire and Commonwealth, because, you know, that was the economic base which they thought was still very powerful and viable. And in 1945-46, well, in 1944, I think, or even earlier, Churchill said at one stage, "I have not become Her Majesty's or His Majesty's Prime Minister in order to preside over the dismantlement of the British Empire." So there was a very strong sense that the British Empire was still a viable proposition after 1945. And the Attlee government, actually the Labour government, continued this. And what is, of course, interesting in this, that imperial traditions and ideas usually live an afterlife, even if decolonization had already happened. India was lost by 1948. even if the other colonies had also liberation movements. You suddenly wondered whether it was still possible to hold the whole thing together. Even the Dutch resistance movement, who had experienced German colonialism in the Second World War, thought after 1945 that it would be possible to keep the Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, until the Americans came along and said, well, the Japanese have now retreated, and therefore, well, it is yours again, but we are not going to help you defeat the liberation movements in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, so that you can reestablish your Dutch empire again. And how quickly the Dutch then left these former colonies of theirs is really also a chapter which has not been studied very much. We've always focused on the British Empire, but that empire, of course, came definitely to an end in 1956. And here again, it's a Suez crisis, but not the Sixth Fleet that was sent by Eisenhower to Egypt to stop the reoccupation of the Suez Canal and the establishment of British, French, and Israeli interests at that point, also in the Middle East. But what Eisenhower did was he found Anthony Eden, who was prime minister at the time, and said, if you don't get out of Egypt very quickly, I will sink your pound. And you should wonder how quickly Eden then ate humble pie, actually, and got out. And of course, interestingly enough, very soon thereafter, under Macmillan, who was the successor to Eden as prime minister, the Brits then first of all created the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, in the late 60s, and then in the 70s began to apply, no, in the 60s already began to apply for membership in the European Economic Community, which was very prosperous at the time and very attractive. So it's a tragedy in some ways that the Brits adhere to their empire, and therefore, if I may add this, it's an even greater tragedy that they now decided to do their Brexit and leave the European Union, hoping to cope on their own, no longer having an empire, just a commonwealth, and they are looking to Australia and New Zealand as possible trading partners. But they have, meanwhile, of course, very different trading arrangements in the Far East, and also with Europe and other parts of the world. So there are always these ironies in history that lead me to emphasize not merely the correct calculations of strategic elites and decision makers, as I mentioned, because the Marshall Plan was a correct calculation. So we are rightly celebrating the 75th anniversary, but it is also the misperceptions and miscalculations that are behind a lot of wrong turnings that took place in the past, and the most recent of that is Putin and his invasion of the Ukraine.
Well, we still have about 9 questions left and only about 10 minutes. So we're not going to get to all of them, but if I can do maybe rapid fire, give you a couple quick questions, shorter answers to try and get
can you bundle them, and I will try to answer them quickly.
Okay. So what was the role of Konrad Adenauer in the Marshall Plan?
Very important, because he was chancellor in 1950, of course, and he was a Rhenish politician, a Rhineland politician, Catholic. And I think he was always, from his entire political background, going back to the Weimar Republic, the 1920s in Germany, an anti-Prussian, actually. He was suspicious of the sort of blockbuster Prussia that dominated Germany also after the First World War. Prussia was the largest state in this federation, and therefore I think he was always looking towards France. And when, of course, he had suffered under the Nazis, he was imprisoned partly even by them. He was in favor of European reconstruction, surely, but of West European reconstruction. He was an anti-communist also, and therefore he played a crucial role in 1951 when it came to the point of ratifying, signing on the dotted line, the agreement for coal and steel. And he actually got German industrialists around the table and said, I need this law to be passed by your parliament in Bonn because it is vital for my foreign policy, which is French and West European orientated. And therefore, I think he had a powerful voice in the settlement that was then found for coal and steel in 1951, together with Monet, of course.
All right, Paul says that you haven't really mentioned the role and influence of George Kennan. So any quick thoughts on Kennan?
Well, very good. Yes, of course, he is crucial, but I didn't mention him because he was partly still based in Moscow in the late 40s, and also his expertise was in Eastern Europe. He was not one of these business people. He knew Germany, of course, very well from the 1920s and 30s already, and was clearly an expert. But I think he was the one who was crucial then in sort of inserting the anti-communist, the fear that or the threat of the Soviet Union into the debate in 1947. And I think he therefore played a different role, but nevertheless a very important role also in the settlement that was found then in 1948-49 with regard to the reconstruction, not just, as I said, the economic reconstruction, but also the power political reconstruction, the security angle of it through NATO.
Going back to what you mentioned about Janet Yellen and the possible kind of Marshall Plan for Ukraine, we see these people talk about Marshall Plan after wars or conflict where there's destruction of physical property. But we had a question, somebody asked, do you think we could have a Marshall Plan for something more like climate change or, you know, sustainable development goals to get middle income countries up? We have sea levels rising, Indonesia is moving their capital because they're worried about this. So do you think we could have kind of a Marshall Plan for something more ambiguous like climate change rather than physical destruction?
Yeah. Well, again, this is a very good question about the future, but I don't want to be a coward this time and actually try to be realistic about this. I think there is, of course, a growing consciousness of the threat we all live under. And, you know, I belong to a generation that was very fortunate growing up during the Reconstruction period and in prosperity, having a career in the academic world. But of course, I'm worried about my grandchildren because they will have to bear the consequences of, on the one hand, the mistakes that are being made, but also the politics of all this. And the problem, first of all, is just looking at this country, the United States, how divided it is over these issues. and how difficult it is to arrive at some kind of a consensus. And then to think of the whole world. I think you have 197 nation states in the world right now. They all will have to come on board of this and make their contribution. And in this respect, I would actually like to look at Europe. I think they have made more progress on this front, not only in that they drive very little cars instead of SUVs and gas guzzlers in this country that have, boomed actually when you look at our roads, but they have also, I think, looked seriously at alternative sources of energy, wind power, and other means of generating energy. And it's very interesting, I think, that even in Germany, which was very green in many ways in the past, they are now discussing again the importance of a nuclear, peaceful nuclear power. And that is, of course, under the impact of the discovery, how dependent they had become, I think, again, dangerously dependent on gas and oil imports from Russia. We hadn't really appreciated this. There was this debate on Nord Stream and oil coming through the Baltic Sea, etc. But we now realize just how dependent Germany was. And I think there will also be major consequences there, not just on the part of Scholz, but also of German industry. Because the reason why I think the Germans held off for so long, joining sanctions and agreeing to cutting off trade links with Russia, was that industry, while it was cold, also, and homes were very dependent on these deliveries, and they were criticized for it, of course, severely. But I think they were just trying to slow down and retard this change, a dramatic change that they had to make. So in this respect, I think Europe is worthwhile looking at in terms of its responses now, not just to Putin, but also in terms of its planning for a very different future that we will have ahead of us. And therefore, we have to do something about it. But for me, this is very easy to say, because I don't think I will live to see all the catastrophes that will happen if nothing is done very urgently in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Well, not to end on a sad note as that, but I want to thank you so much for spending the evening with us. We did record the event, and so we will be sending out the link to the recording tomorrow. And if you have any closing thoughts, maybe something a little bit more optimistic for us to take away for the end of the night, any closing thoughts?
Well, in that case, I would merely like to point at this print that I have behind me, because it is a very interesting print which shows the rise of the sun emerging slowly from the fog and conflicts of the present. And I would like to, even at my age, like to be an optimist, partly because I've been a teacher for too long. And I think when you have younger people in front of you, to tell them about the catastrophes that are coming down the road is too depressing. I would like to encourage them to take action, actually, and be involved in the decision-making that are being made and have to be made, not just by strategic elites, but in the age of populism and the social media can also be undertaken from below. And that, it seems to me, is a very different picture, as I outlined earlier, from what we have for the early post-war period. So thank you very much for listening to this discussion also, and I look forward to seeing the Zoom Zoom link that you will send us. Thank you.
Absolutely. It will come out tomorrow. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great night.